For Putin, the war in Ukraine is not only turning into a catastrophe on the front lines, but the domestic political situation in Russia is also becoming increasingly critical. The situation is now so unstable that, in extreme cases, a civil war could actually break out in Russia. But why is such a war within the country actually becoming more and more likely? In this video, we want to present the specific reasons for this and show you what effects a civil war could have on the country. First of all, it could be much worse than you might think at first glance, including for the rest of the world. One of the main reasons why a civil war could break out in Russia is that Vladimir Putin's image as a great protector is crumbling. And massively so. The military failures in Ukraine have severely shaken the population's trust in his leadership qualities. The surprise Ukrainian invasion of the Russian region of Kursk contributed significantly to this. For many Russians, this was a shock, because the idea that a foreign army could reach Russian soil again would have been unthinkable a few years ago. In addition, there are regular drone attacks on Moscow, which keep the capital on alert and increase the feeling of insecurity. For years, Putin has portrayed his ability to protect Russia from external threats as his greatest strength. Now that it is clear that he can no longer do so, there is a noticeable change in mood among the Russian population. In the eyes of many Russians, the president suddenly appears weak and unprepared. In fact, the general population is also gradually beginning to doubt whether Putin can still lead the country. And so more and more Russians are no longer willing to follow his instructions unconditionally. In this atmosphere of mistrust and growing resistance, the danger of Russia plunging into chaos and internal conflicts naturally grows. However, it is not just the growing awareness among Russians that Putin is not as strong as previously thought that is increasing the risk of civil war. In fact, there is also great discontent among the population for other reasons. One of these is the country's economic situation. High inflation and rising interest rates are hitting millions of Russians hard. Basic foodstuffs and everyday goods are becoming increasingly expensive, while wages are largely stagnating. Added to this is the massive withdrawal of Western brands that have shaped Russians' everyday lives for decades. Well-known companies such as McDonald's, Starbucks, and IKEA have now disappeared from Russia due to the political situation. In fact, clone companies have been set up whose logos and products have been blatantly copied from the originals. Although the Russian clones try to offer almost everything that was previously available from Western companies, they do not manage to do so satisfactorily. In plain language, Russians would still prefer to eat a real Big Mac or shop in the original Swedish furniture store instead of having to resort to cheap copies. People in the cities in particular are feeling this loss of lifestyle and are dissatisfied. At the same time, war weariness is spreading. Over half of the Russian population is now in favor of withdrawing from Ukraine, as surveys show. The conflict, which has now cost countless soldiers their lives, is increasingly seen as pointless. Many families mourn fallen relatives while at the same time struggling with economic uncertainty. This growing frustration is also evident on the streets. In the meantime, protests have already taken place in numerous cities. People of all ages have gathered to demonstrate against political stagnation and social injustice. This is a sign that Russian society is becoming more politically alert, but also more divided and more susceptible to major unrest. The situation is therefore explosive. Internal power struggles within Russian politics could also contribute to a civil war. In Russia, a bitter power struggle has long been raging behind the scenes, shaking the foundations of the Kremlin. The fact that Putin, as explained earlier, is no longer perceived as powerful as he once was, is making the situation worse. Other politicians and well-connected civil servants are now sensing an opportunity to come to power. The most likely successor to Putin is currently Nikolai Patrushev, actually a close confidant of the president who headed the Russian Secret Service for years. At the same time, the threat from mercenary leaders who were once loyal allies of the Kremlin is also growing. The late Yevgeny Prigozhin, founder of the Wagner Group, for example, shocked the Kremlin with his open criticism of the military leadership. Putin saw this as an act of treason that he had not anticipated. After Prigozhin's death, more mercenary commanders followed. Their demands for reforms and military resistance to the Kremlin elite are further fueling tensions. The combination of rising rivals and dissatisfied military leaders could be the spark that plunges the country into civil war. Another factor that could lead to civil war is growing discontent among the oligarchs. These are the country's wealthy elites, who often owe their wealth and influence to their proximity to the Kremlin. Between Putin and the oligarchs, one hand washes the other has long been the case. This means nothing less than that the state strongly favors rich businessmen, who in turn support Putin's government with all means. But now this formerly unshakable power base is beginning to crumble. Oleg Deripaska, one of the most influential oligarchs and Putin's most loyal supporter to date, for example, has sharply criticized the war in Ukraine and the resulting economic consequences. In fact, he recently even said publicly that peace is necessary, as soon as possible, a statement that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. But why is discontent among the oligarchs currently growing so strongly? The reason for this is, of course, money. The Western sanctions are not only hitting the Russian state, but also the oligarchs directly. Their access to international markets, assets, and luxury goods is drastically restricted. Many of them have lost billions, and their global networks are in danger. All of this is causing the loyalty of the oligarchs to Putin to falter. This elite used to be a guarantee of stability. They held together Russia's economic backbone and ensured that Putin remained unassailable domestically. But now a dangerous dynamic seems to be developing. When even influential oligarchs like Deripaska openly oppose the Kremlin's policies, this indicates deeper cracks in the power structure. As you can see, the domestic political situation in Russia has become truly explosive. The economy is going down the drain, trust in Putin is dwindling due to his bad decisions and military defeats, and an ever larger part of the population no longer wants to support the senseless war that has already cost so many of their loved ones their lives. In the Kremlin and in the military, former Putin supporters are rubbing their hands at the chance to gain power themselves through the unstable situation, and even the influential oligarchs no longer support the government's course. If things continue like this, it seems to be only a matter of time before things escalate on Russia's streets. So now you know the reasons why the situation in Russia is escalating, and civil war is becoming more and more likely. But the question remains what the consequences of a civil war in Russia would be. How would it affect the Ukraine war and world politics? A civil war in Russia could actually trigger one of the most profound changes in modern history, namely, the disintegration of the largest country in the world. Russia is a multi-ethnic state with over 190 ethnic groups. Regions such as Czechia and Dagestan in the North Caucasus, or Tatarstan in the heart of Russia, could use the opportunity to break away from the central government in Moscow. These areas often have their own language, culture, and religion that has been suppressed by Russian dominance. If they see a realistic chance of becoming independent of the central government, local leaders or warlords could try to take control of their regions. This could in turn lead to chaotic battles for resources and territory. Tensions could also escalate between regions, especially when it comes to strategic areas such as the rich oil and gas reserves in Siberia or the military bases in the Caucasus. A civil war in Russia would not only plunge the country itself into chaos, but would also endanger global security. As you probably know, Russia has one of the largest nuclear weapons arsenals in the world. And if central control over the military crumbles, there could be an uncontrolled distribution of these weapons. Extremist groups could try to exploit the situation to gain access to the nuclear weapons, with potentially catastrophic consequences for the world. Another consequence of a civil war could, of course, be the complete economic collapse of Russia. It could paralyze pipelines, destroy production facilities, and bring exports to a complete standstill. The consequences would be dramatic, and not just for Russia. Europe, which continues to rely on Russian energy despite sanctions, would struggle with acute supply shortages. Worldwide, oil and gas prices would probably also explode, which would further destabilize already struggling economies. But it would not just be the energy supply that would be affected. A civil war would also trigger a massive flight of capital. Even more international investors would withdraw for fear of instability and sanctions, which would further drag the Russian economy down. At the same time, millions of skilled workers and well-trained employees could leave the country to look for safety and jobs abroad. This so-called brain drain would harm Russia in the long term and make reconstruction after a possible end to the conflict much more difficult. Incidentally, Russia has already had to cope with a similar brain drain. Of course, a civil war would first and foremost trigger a devastating humanitarian crisis. Millions of people would flee Russia to escape the war and violence. Neighboring countries such as Kazakhstan, Poland, and the Baltic states would be faced with an enormous wave of refugees. The infrastructure of many of these countries is already strained by the ongoing tensions in the region. A sudden influx of hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of Russian refugees could push the social and economic systems of these countries to their limits. There is therefore a real danger that a civil war in Russia could turn the country into a failed state in the long term. In other words, a failed state that can neither maintain control over its territory nor the basic functions of government. Such a failed state would pose an enormous challenge for the international community. Since Russia has an area of 17 million square kilometers and a huge population, it would be extremely difficult to rebuild the country. Reconstruction after a civil war could therefore take decades and the costs would be unforeseeable. But what do you think will happen in Russia? Will there be a civil war or not? Feel free to write us your predictions and thoughts in the comments. Well, folks, and with that, we end our video today. Write us your thoughts on this in the comments, and let us know about which topics we should make a video about. Otherwise, subscribe to our channel and see you next time here at Wikivedia Plus. Thank you all for watching to the end. I hope you enjoyed our content. A big hug, and until then, bye!